So I am so grateful to share this time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. This week, we are focusing on part 3 of 6, 20th century public policy and the civil rights movement. This marks a period when racism in society and public policy intensified beyond the South, in part because of population shifts, such as the Great Migration, and the continuing outsized influence of Southern politicians on federal policy. All of this was undergirded by our country's perpetuation of the myth of racial inferiority and the strengthening influence of white supremacy across the country. Other nations with similarly sordid racial pasts have sought to move forward using a process often called truth and reconciliation. I believe America is in desperate need of such a process. And so we here for these 6 weeks are embarking on a search for more truth as a foundation for where we go moving forward. Much of this history is painful, as we have already seen, incomprehensible even, especially for those of us who believe that we are good people who seek justice and peace for everyone. Much of this history isn't just history, but it is alive and well and pervasive in our society today. I believe that in bringing to light this history of ours that we should have known but didn't, and seeing its impact on our country even today, we may develop a new or a renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address these profound inequities. So let's continue. We begin with a brief recap of our class last week, where we saw the literally unchecked power of white supremacy, especially in the South, where loss in the war intensified the anger and the desire for dominance over those who had formerly been held as slaves. Even the presence of federal troops during the short period of Reconstruction couldn't stop it. We saw how the insidious application of the 13th Amendment and its loophole prohibited slavery except in the case of conviction of a crime, led to the passage of laws, particularly in Southern states, known as Black Codes, which resulted in massive arrest and incarceration of Black people who were then leased out for the financial benefit of the state. And even when convict leasing came to an end, the state continued to use the labor of those unlawfully, unjustly arrested and incarcerated on public chain gangs for the benefits of the state projects. And we see the echoes of that even today, and we will look at this next week when we focus on our country's criminal justice system, where those who are incarcerated work hard and earn money that is received back by the prisons and the states that hold them captive. We saw how in 1896, the Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson made separate but equal the law of the land. And in virtually every aspect of social interactions, huge barriers were erected between Black and white people and led to 70 years of punitive segregation, whose legacy exists today, as I suspect that many of us continue to live in segregated communities, not because we chose that necessarily, but that is the legacy of much of the housing segregation that we're going to look at tonight. We know that that segregation was implemented through a series of Jim Crow laws that affected every aspect of social interactions. And that separation, with a particular emphasis on disenfranchising Black voters, led to the rash of terror lynchings that demonstrated the complicity of entire communities, especially the elected leadership, in these horrific acts of violence, all designed to establish control. And the degree to which they were carried out with impunity sent a clear message that those who were the victims of these events really had nowhere to turn. And so conditions in the South, economic and cultural and terror, and opportunities in the North and West led to what is known as the Great Migration, where more than 6 million African Americans left the South and moved to the North and West, with huge demographic impacts across our country. One of the interesting things that comes about as we begin to look at various aspects of our country's history, we begin to see the way that patterns of behavior and belief shape actions. And one way to look at this is to observe a timeline of the construction of Confederate monuments in the United States. And I know there's a lot of detail on here. There will be a detailed quiz at the end of this evening's program to make sure you've memorized the chart. But in the meantime, we begin in 1861 at the very start of the Civil War, and this chart ends in 2016. And what you see in 1861 is that there were 4 Confederate monuments erected, presumably to leaders of the war effort for the Confederacy. And then at the end of the war, and in 1866, after the foundation formation of the Ku Klux Klan, you see a few more of these Confederate monuments erected. And then it's kind of a steady state, status quo circumstance until we come to the end of the 19th century, the period where we see the tremendous increase in lynchings, where we see the beginning of the Great Migration. In the middle of that, in 1915, the movie D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation movie came out, and we will talk more about that in a future class. But you see the tremendous explosion of the number of Confederate monuments that were being erected, largely in the South, but not exclusively. There's one in Idaho, there's one in Montana, there are a couple in New York. But that was a period of time where anxiety over the prospective rights of Black people, of their migration out of the plantation culture to the rest of the country, resulted in a huge emphasis on the glories of the leaders of the Confederacy. And we see it continuing during the 1920s, when there were a number of series of race riots in the country, typically over job opportunities, as we heard last week. And then things settled down a bit until the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the civil rights movement comes into its own. And once again, we see this emphasis on erecting monuments to the vaunted leaders of the Confederacy. So we turn our attention now to the early to mid 20th century, and we're going to look at 5 different aspects of public policy. And these are national public policies. These are not limited to the South, but these policies further cemented racial discrimination across the country. The housing market, Social Security as a bill, a law, the GI Bill, public education, and even the interstate highway system all played a role in further cementing this discrimination. And then we will turn our attention to the pivotal events and the impact of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. So beginning with housing segregation, Until 1917, cities across the country, although they were largely in the South where most of the African-American population lived, cities could mandate the areas where Black people could live. You can live here, you cannot live here. And it was everywhere. It was the way it was done. But there was a Supreme Court decision that year, Buchanan v. Worley, that said it was unconstitutional to set aside those areas where Black people had to live. It was unconstitutional because it was the cities that were mandating it. And so it was the city's mandates that had to stop, but not necessarily the determination that Black people could only live here. And so what emerged in the wake of that Supreme Court decision was a transition to what were known as racially restricted deed covenants. These were clauses written into property deeds that said a particular property could only be sold to another white person. There was an attempt in 1926 to say that even that should be unconstitutional. But the court, in its decision that year, said, nah, they're okay. It's all right to do that. And so by 1940, 80% of the properties in Chicago and LA and 85% of the properties in Detroit, as an example, carried these racially restricted deed covenants. You could only sell your house, your property, to another white person. Yet another attempt was made to get the Supreme Court to say that this was unconstitutional, even though Plessy v. Ferguson kind of said separate but equal is okay. And the court once again refused to make that declaration, and they reaffirmed the voluntary usage of these racially restricted deed covenants. And they were only ultimately outlawed with the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, 50 some years after the court said cities couldn't mandate these residential locations. And in the midst of all of this, Congress passed the National Housing Act of 1934, which created the Federal Housing Administration. That action was taken because the national home ownership system was in absolute crisis. Back in the day, to get a mortgage, you needed to make a sizable down payment, 20%, 25%, 30%, and the mortgage repayment period was nominally 10 years. And while that was affordable for some people early on, the Great Depression and the collapse of the market resulted in a circumstance where almost 50% of mortgages across the United States were in default. And of course, no new housing was being built. It was absolute chaos. And so Congress passed the National Housing Act of 1934, creating the Federal Housing Administration, and this was instrumental in alleviating that crisis. What it did, the Federal Housing Administration did not issue mortgages, but they would insure mortgages issued by banks. So it gave banks the confidence to issue mortgages that would have a 5% down payment and a repayment period of up to 30 years. And so this opened up the housing market to many, many more people than had ever had the opportunity for home ownership. But along with the passage of this act, an entity called the Homeowners Loan Corporation created what were called residential security maps that covered 239 cities across the country. And these were maps that introduced into common parlance the term redlining. Because what these maps did, they identified sections of cities where the practice was to deny or limit financial services to certain neighborhoods based on their racial or ethnic composition, without regard to the residents' qualifications or credit worthiness. It was strictly based on race and ethnicity. And here's a map. Here's the city of Atlanta in 1935. And accompanying this would be a legend, and it would say the green areas are labeled best places for a bank to issue a mortgage, best place for the Federal Housing Administration to insure such a mortgage. The blue areas are labeled still desirable. The yellow, that tag is definitely declining, and red is labeled hazardous, meaning this is not a place that a bank would want to issue a mortgage. And the descriptions of these colors of these areas included such terms as infiltration, and it described populations that were subversive or undesirable or inharmonious or lower grade in the red areas and the yellow areas. And it's interesting that there is a website called Mapping Inequality that has taken 150 of these cities and today has mapped poverty levels and the overlap between today's poverty levels in these cities and the residential security maps of the 1930s is strikingly similar. And so that legacy has continued unabated. Now, the way this worked, there would be an appraiser from the FHA who would go out and look at a property that a bank was considering issuing a mortgage for. And there was an underwriter's manual that these appraisers would use in order to assess whether a particular property was green or yellow or blue or red. And that underwriter's manual included such statements as deed restrictions are apt to prove more effective than a zoning ordinance in providing protection from adverse influences. Where the same deed restrictions apply over a broad area, these racially restrictive deed covenants, where these restrictions relate to racial occupancy, a favorable condition for a mortgage is apt to exist. The valuator, FHA appraiser, should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction might be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances, and to be really effective should include the provisions listed below, which include prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they were intended. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. In the late 1930s, as Detroit grew outward, white families began to settle near a Black enclave adjacent to 8 Mile Road. By 1940, the Blacks were surrounded, but neither they nor the whites could get FHA insurance because of the proximity of an inharmonious racial group. So in 1941, an enterprising white developer built a concrete wall between the white and Black areas. The FHA appraisers then took another look and approved the mortgages on the white properties. And this approach to issuing mortgages, this approach to enabling home ownership was not limited to the FHA. It was adopted by the Veterans Administration, and we'll see that as we look at the GI Bill following World War II. And this approach was also used by private realtors. So it became the way real estate and home ownership was managed and processed. And just like immediately following the Civil War, when Black people were unable to acquire land, this was simply the next iteration of preventing that from occurring. So what are you to do? You are a financially stable Black person, Black couple. You want to own your own home. You have the wherewithal to buy one, but you can't get a mortgage. Perhaps you can't afford the traditional 20% down 10-year repayment, and the FHA won't insure one for you. So what are you to do? Well, in the great capitalist society, a new opportunity was created, and it was called contracts for deed. These were arrangements usually offered by speculators who bought properties expressly for this purpose. It required a down payment and regular monthly installments from the occupant, but that's where the similarities to a mortgage ended. The sale price and the effective interest rate tended to be wildly inflated because these were people who could not buy a home in the normative system. And so they would be forced to pay a higher purchase price and a higher interest rate. The buyer assumed all the responsibilities of a homeowner, including repairs and taxes, but the seller retained the title, along with the power to evict the resident for missing even a single payment. As a result, families who bought on contract didn't accumulate equity, and they faced a long, precarious path to ownership. In fact, there were countless individuals who satisfied the contractual terms only to be presented with an insurance bill at the end of the contract, sometimes thousands of dollars that had to be paid within 30 days, or the contract to purchase the home was null and void. These speculators undertook such actions as hiring Black women to go into yellow and even green neighborhoods in these cities and push a baby carriage up and down the streets of the community. And they would be followed by an agent for one of these contract for deed companies who would knock on the doors in the community and say, you know they're coming, and you don't want to be the last person to sell your house when they're here. And so that was one of the ways that they were able to secure properties at below market rates and then turn around and offer them on contract for deed at exorbitant rates. And so these exorbitant terms, along with the lack of equity to borrow against it, meant Black families simply didn't have the means to invest in their properties, send their children to college, but the lack of investment contributed to the physical decline of their neighborhoods. So ultimately, this practice came to an end, and yet there are echoes of it in the subprime mortgage crisis of recent years. And even now, large banks, HCSB, Wells Fargo, are being issued huge fines for continuing to try to lock out certain racial and ethnic groups from the housing markets in their communities. But this whole practice, this whole process continued unabated for more than 50 years. Sorry, for 35 years. The 35 years that marked the greatest expansion of home building and home ownership in the United States, finally outlawed by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And so this intentionally discriminatory housing policy perpetuated and intensified housing segregation. And that in turn led naturally to educational segregation, where even the quality of the educational institutions was impacted, because in many jurisdictions, educational funding came from property taxes. And as the value of particularly these city properties began to decline because of lack of investment, the property tax available to fund education was reduced, which intensified the inequity in education between Black and white students, which had an impact on employability and ultimately on income levels and even environmental and health impacts as the cities became locations where there was a lack of green space, where there was a higher concentration of auto exhaust, where there was less opportunity for fresh food and grocery stores, and all of it intensified as a consequence of this segregation policy. And one of the things that it led to, is what is known as the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap in the United States. Today, the average wealth, the average net worth of the average Black family is 5% of that of the average white family. And the income of the average Black family is 60% of the average white family. And that racial wealth gap tripled in the period between 1984 and 2009. And this issue of home ownership at present means that about 40% of Black households own their own homes, where nearly 3/4 of white households own their own homes. So leaving aside the cultural and social demographics of the segregation, the economic impact is and continues to be huge. So let's take a look at some other public programs that were passed along this time. First is the Social Security Act of 1935. You may know that Title II is called the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance, the part that most of us think of, although why they had to call it old age, surely they could have come up with a better term, never mind. In any case, that is the retirement program, if you will. And when it was written, 65% of African Americans living in the United States at the time were excluded from Social Security because domestic and farm workers were excluded from the program. And you may recall that after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, in many states, the only employment opportunities open to those formerly enslaved and their descendants were as domestic or farm workers. And so they were locked out of that program that was designed to offer a safety net, a floor, if you will, for retirement. And while there were some adjustments made to the act in 1950 and 1954, by then it had been 20 years of people not being able to participate in Social Security. And so it was a huge hill to climb to think that at some point, at that point, you would somehow seek to be involved in the program. And importantly, the other benefit programs that we don't see as often, but are part of the Social Security Act, were block grants of funds that were sent to the states in order to implement the benefits plans that were included. And then it was up to the states to decide to whom they would issue the funds, who could participate in these benefit programs. And you can imagine the distinguishing characteristics of the application of some of these benefit programs, particularly in the South. At the same time, about 10 years later, as World War II was coming to an end, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known as the GI Bill. And when it was passed, it was declared to be the most race-neutral bill ever passed by Congress. Sounds like another ray of hope, doesn't it? But in order for the bill to pass, the Southern legislators demanded a clause that said the GI Bill would be implemented and administered at the state level with no federal oversight. And so each state chose how to handle the GI Bill to the benefit of veterans in their communities. And as you might expect, particularly but not exclusively in the South, the GI Bill implementation resulted in discrimination in housing. We know they utilized the same policies and principles as the FHA. There was discrimination in education for returning veterans. Basically, the GI Bill provided for either college education or vocational education for returning GIs. In many instances, Black GIs did not have the financial foundation to be able to go off to college for 2, 3, 4 years to gain an education. And so often they would turn to or would be directed to the vocational schools. Even for those who had the ability and the desire and the capability to go to college, there was not a single college or university in the South, except for the historically Black colleges and universities, that would accept a single Black student, not one. And the HBCUs were flooded with applicants that they could not accommodate. It is possible that a Black GI could go to college in the North, but those few colleges and universities who would accept them had very significant quotas in terms of the number of minority people they would accept. So for those who sought to get education benefits from the GI Bill, those African Americans, they were almost universally directed to trade schools. And in many instances, when they arrived, they learned that the products and the equipment, the materials being used to train for a vocation were only available for use by the white students. And the Black GIs needed to learn by watching the white students get their vocational education. And so all of this implementation of what was heralded as the most race-neutral bill ever passed by Congress simply intensified segregation and the economic consequences. And we do know that at the end of World War II, there was a resurgence of violence against African Americans who had served in the military. Estimates are there were about 1 million African Americans who served in uniform during World War II. And there were circumstances where this raised a tremendous backlash. One such case involved a man named Isaac Woodard. And his case is instructive not just because of the circumstances, but because of the effect what happened to him had on President Harry S. Truman. So on the evening of February 12th, 1946, Isaac Woodard, who was a 26-year-old Black Army veteran who had been honorably discharged that day from the Army, boarded a bus in Augusta, Georgia. He was heading to Winsboro, South Carolina, to reunite with his wife. The bus driver made a stop en route, and Woodard asked if he had time to use the bathroom. The bus driver cursed at him, and according to Isaac, he cursed back, was not allowed to go to the bathroom. When they made their next stop, the bus driver approached some police who were at the bus station and told them that Woodard had been impudent. So the police ordered him off the bus. When he tried to give his version of the events, a police officer struck him with a nightstick. Woodard was escorted to the nearby jail, where he was repeatedly beaten by the police chief, Linwood Shull. Woodard said that Shull pounded him in his eyes with the end of a nightstick until he blacked out. And when he regained consciousness, he couldn't see. Woodard was charged with disorderly conduct because the police said he had been intoxicated, even though all of the other passengers on the bus said that there had been no alcohol involved. After he paid a fine, Woodard was driven to a veterans hospital in Columbia, where doctors told him that he would be permanently blind. He and his wife could not make a living in the South, and he moved to New York City to live with relatives, and was unable to find any gainful employment. Finally, the Department of Justice brought charges against the police chief, Linwood Shull. But an all-white jury quickly exonerated him from any crime. And author David McCullough writes that Isaac Woodard made an everlasting impression on President Truman, moving him in ways that statistics never would have. So Truman may have had little sway over the South Carolina courts, but he was not without influence. And as a consequence, he eventually created the President's Committee on Civil Rights, the first National Civil Rights Commission, which released its report in October of 1947. And on July 26, 1948, Truman issued an executive order desegregating the United States Armed Forces. And so Isaac Woodard's impact was enormous in that regard, and yet nothing much changed in the Southern court system. So we turn our attention now to school desegregation during this time period. We know that Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 said separate but equal, and more than any other aspect of our environment, the separate but unequal was true of schools. In many states, public schools were not even funded for Black students. If they were, the funding levels were significantly lower than those for white students. And they were all based on the underlying assumptions about Black inferiority and inability. And so as a consequence of all of this, in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, 5 million African Americans had less than 5 years of education by 1940. In South Carolina and Louisiana, 60% had no more than a 4th or 5th grade education. And so along came the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education. And of course, Delaware played a major role in that Supreme Court case. 5 entities combined, Delaware was one. And it was filed in 1952, but the decision was not handed down until 1954. And that's because Chief Justice Fred Vinson, who was in office when the case was filed, passed away. And so a new Chief Justice had to be named to the Supreme Court. And so President Eisenhower named former California Governor Earl Warren to be the Supreme Court Chief Justice. Later said it was the worst decision that he had made in his whole political career. But shortly after naming Warren as Chief Justice, Eisenhower held a dinner at the White House where he invited a lot of representatives and senators, particularly from the South. And the purpose was to explain to Chief Warren that Southerners, quote, are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big, overgrown Negroes. In any case, by this time, Delaware only had one public high school. It was Howard High School in Wilmington. It was the only high school in the state that a Black student could go to. And so the average education of a Black person in Delaware was 7.2 years because there was simply nowhere to go. Once the Brown v. Board of Education decision was handed down, resistance was massive. The district court in Delaware authorized a 12-year delay because there had been a secondary decision that said that desegregation should be implemented with all deliberate speed. And the Delaware court decided that a full 12 years of an educational season was all deliberate speed for implementing desegregation. Prince Edward County in Virginia closed all of its public schools from 1959 to 1964. Southern white segregationists sent money to create white private schools, but they only served a small fraction of the white students. Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina, they do keep showing up here, don't they? Anyway, they determined that the federal courts had no jurisdiction and they did not need to follow the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Georgia repealed its ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and voted to impeach the Supreme Court. And so what developed became known as the Southern Manifesto, which was to stall and defy. And even today, the Alabama Constitution still mandates segregated schools for all of its public students. And there were a number of notable incidents that occurred. The first was in 1957 with the Little Rock nine high school students who desegregated Central High School in Little Rock. You see this picture of Elizabeth Eckford, you've probably seen it before. The 9 students knew that they would face tremendous hatred and anger and opposition. And so they decided that they would all meet together outside of the school area so that they could go together as a group, all 9 of them, into the school at once. But Elizabeth Eckford's parents didn't have a telephone and she didn't get the message. And so she ended up going to school all by herself, facing the mob alone. There is a wonderful book written by Melba Patillo Beals called Warriors Don't Cry. She was another of the 9 students, and she writes a story about her full year's experience at Central High School, and it is compelling. I sort of thought once they got the National Guard and once they were able to go into the school, things settled down, but that was absolutely not the case. We also know the story of Ruby Bridges. Ruby was one of 6 first graders, incoming first graders, identified by the NAACP in New Orleans as being exceptionally bright, likely to do extraordinarily well in school. And these 6 children, 6 first graders, were selected to desegregate the William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans in 1960. But the night before the first day of class, Ruby's parents got a call that the other 5 parents had decided that they did not want to subject their children to this, and they were withdrawing from the program. But Ruby's parents went ahead, and she enrolled in William Frantz Elementary School. Every white parent in the school refused to have their children in a classroom with Ruby. Every white teacher in the school, save one, refused to have Ruby as a student. And so Barbara Henry, a white woman transplant teacher from Boston, became Ruby's teacher. And for that whole entire school year, the U.S. Marshals escorted Ruby to school and to and from school to keep her safe. And she and Barbara Henry met in a classroom for first grade. As a consequence of daring to take this step, the local grocery store banned the Bridges family from shopping there. Her father was fired from his job, and her grandparents were evicted from their sharecroppers farm as a consequence. And when we look at the consequences of all of this resistance and all of this anger and hatred and discrimination, when we look today at the states with the lowest level of educational attainment in the country, they include Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia. And so the consequences of this were not just for Black students, but for all of us. And that's the point in Heather McGee's book, Racism Hurts All of Us. And you may have seen Norman Rockwell's illustration of Little Ruby Bridges. I heard her speak at Smith College a number of years ago, and she is today an activist decades later with a compelling story to tell. We are going to hear her story on one of our Thursday evening Peace and Justice Work Group events coming up this spring. So now we'll turn our attention to the interstate highway system. Really? Discriminatory? Indeed, it was created as a result of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 that authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways spanning the nation. Today, the cost of maintaining that network is over $120 billion a year. During the initial construction period, more than 475,000 families, more than 1 million people, were displaced from their homes, their property seized by eminent domain. And the vast majority of those affected by the claiming of their property were low-income people of color in urban core areas. And then, with these roads going through, these highways going through divided communities, once again, the pollution, the traffic impact has had health and environmental consequences on the people who are still left living in the surrounding areas. So there we are with some major public policies that had intentionally, to one degree or another, discriminatory purposes. But the consequences began to trigger reactions in people about the unfairness of some of this. But what really got the civil rights moving was television. And I like it to what we have seen happen in recent years with the publication of cell phone videos of attacks on unarmed Black people. Well, this was the 1950s, and suddenly on TV, people were seeing in their living room the examples of the kind of actions that were being taken. Police dogs beaten by batons, fire hoses directed at individuals, the famous attempt to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge for voting rights in Selma. And during this period of time, as these images began to appear and energy began to be created to rectify some of these rights, the biggest single period of the erection of Confederate monuments occurred in our country. Between 1950 and 1975, 150 new Confederate monuments were erected across the country. And what we see from these photographs is that the law enforcement agencies are aligned with this treatment of African Americans. Law enforcement agencies became the face of violent resistance to integration and voting rights. And all of that shapes today's relationships between police and communities of color. One of the pivotal events, it has been described as the pivotal event in energizing the civil rights movement, had to do with Emmett Till. And back in the day, many of us didn't know a lot about him, but I think today we do. Many of us may even have seen the movie made about his life. But he was a 14-year-old boy living with his mother in Chicago, and she wanted him to spend the summer in the country with his uncles and his cousins. And so she had him travel to Money, Mississippi. And one of his early days, he and his cousins went to the Bryant General Store. And apparently Emmett did or said something that upset the proprietor's wife, Carolyn Bryant. And when her husband came home from a trip, she reported that Emmett had done something unforgivable. And so Roy and his half-brother J.W. Milan went to Emmett's uncle's home at night and demanded that his uncle turn over the boy. Although his uncle tried to resist, he knew it was futile, and so Emmett left with the two men and was not seen again until his corpse washed up on the riverbank nearby. Clearly, his killers had not intended for that to happen because he had been weighted down by a cotton gin fan blade tied around his neck with barbed wire. But his mother, Mamie Till, decided that she would have an open casket. She wanted people to see what hate had done to her beautiful little boy. And Jet Magazine took a picture of Emmett's corpse and posted it in its magazine. And people were confronted with the horror caused by this unrepentant hate. There was a trial in September of J.W. Milan and Roy Bryant. It lasted for 5 days. It only took the jury a little over an hour to reach a decision. And one of the jurors said it wouldn't have taken that long, but they had to stop and have some pop. And they found the two men not guilty. But a year later, they were interviewed by Look magazine and acknowledged that, yeah, they did indeed kill Emmett Till, and they got off with it. And that's the way it is when you kill a Black boy in the South. We know that the Montgomery bus boycott had a huge impact on the requirement that Black people sit in the back of buses. Rosa Parks was the visible person in all of that, but she was not the only young woman involved in triggering the boycott, where for one full year, virtually every single Black citizen of Montgomery, which made up almost 99% of the bus ridership, refused to take the bus. And finally, the bus companies capitulated and acknowledged that the buses would be fully integrated. A year later, the Freedom Riders began their activities. It was a desegregation campaign. It was an interracial group of young adults, and they boarded interstate buses going south from Washington, and they stopped at bus stations along the way to test the enforcement of the Supreme Court decisions that prohibited discrimination in interstate travel. Their efforts were highly unpopular with Southerners, and on Mother's Day, May 14th of 1961, a Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders arrived at the Anniston, Alabama bus station shortly after 1 o'clock, only to find that the bus station was locked tight. Led by a local Ku Klux Klan leader, a mob of 50 men armed with pipes, chains, and bats smashed windows, slashed tires, and dented the sides of the riders' bus. Though they had been warned hours earlier that a mob was gathered at the station, local police did not arrive until after the assault had begun. Once the attack subsided, the police pretended to escort the crippled bus to safety, but instead they abandoned it at the Anniston city limits. And soon after the police departed, another armed white mob surrounded the bus and began breaking windows. The Freedom Riders refused to exit the vehicle, but received no aid from two watching highway patrolmen. When a member of the mob tossed a firebomb through a broken bus window, others in the mob attempted to trap the passengers inside the burning vehicle by barricading the door. They fled when the fuel tank began to explode. The riders were able to escape the ensuing flames and smoke, only to be attacked and beaten by the mob outside, riding a bus. A little known event is the Birmingham Children's Crusade. On May 2nd of 1963, more than 1,000 Black children peacefully protested racial segregation in Birmingham. They trained 1,000 young children in nonviolent protest tactics. And those children walked out of their classes that day, and they assembled at the 16th Street Baptist Church to march to downtown Birmingham. Hundreds were assaulted, arrested, and transported to jail in school buses and paddy wagons, but the children didn't relent their peaceful demonstration. The next day, when hundreds more children began to march, Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connors, directed local police and firemen to attack the children with high-pressure fire hoses, batons, and police dogs. Images of children being brutally assaulted by police and snarling dogs appeared on TV and newspapers throughout the nation and the world, provoking global outrage, and the Department of Justice soon intervened. And so the campaign to desegregate Birmingham ended on May 10th, when the city officials agreed to desegregate and release the jailed children. But the following evening, disgruntled residents of the community took part in a series of local bombings. In the wake of all of this, the Birmingham Board of Education announced that all the children who participated in the march would be suspended or expelled from school. A federal district court even upheld that ruling, but ultimately the Fifth Circuit reversed it and ordered the students readmitted to school. Children. And in 1963, a number of pivotal events included the March on Washington. I do not have time to share it at the moment, but if we have time at some point, I will. A personal experience that I had with the March on Washington, which was a march for jobs and freedom. And it featured the landmark speech by Martin Luther King Jr., "I Have a Dream." And that same year, on September 15th, which was Youth Sunday at the 16th Street Baptist Church, the same church where the Children's Crusade kids had gathered, that the children were preparing to lead worship for Youth Day when 19 sticks of dynamite were detonated in the stairwell to the basement. And 4 young girls were killed. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair. Sarah Collins, Addie Mae's younger sister, was blinded by the explosion. It was set off by 4 known Klansmen who made no secret of their participation, but no judicial action was taken. One of the men was taken to trial in 1977, 14 years later, found guilty and sentenced to prison. One of the men died in 1994 without any other action, and the final 2 were tried in 2001 and 2002, found guilty and incarcerated at the very end of their lives. And in 1964, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 3 civil rights activists, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, were stopped for a traffic violation by police, murdered by the police, and their bodies buried in a shallow grave nearby, where they were soon found. And we will hear more about Philadelphia, Mississippi next week, because it has an echo in the presidency of Ronald Reagan. As a consequence, that summer, the Civil Rights Act passed Congress after a 75-day filibuster. Back when a filibuster was really a filibuster and you had to stand up and talk 24/7 for 75 days. But because of all of these events, the groundswell for action had built and affected Congress. That Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin in hiring, promotion, firing, public accommodation, federally funded programs, putting in place laws that would stop the horrific discriminatory violations that had taken place for all these decades. And it also strengthened the enforcement of voting rights and the desegregation of schools. At the same time, a year later, we had the Selma to Montgomery March, in which John Lewis participated, and we have seen the videos of the peaceful marchers being attacked by men on horseback. And as a consequence or a follow-up to that event, Congress that year passed the Voting Rights Act, and we will hear much more about that 2 weeks from tonight. It banned literacy tests. It required the oversight by the federal government of specific jurisdictions known historically to disenfranchise Black voters, and it investigated the use of poll taxes that were preventing people from exercising their right to vote. So this period of the civil rights movement was a huge inflection point in our country's history, and it moved us forward in really significant ways. But what we will see is that just like every other advance that is made, there is a powerful backlash that occurs, and we will see it happen again.